A bright, sunny day in New York City. The sky is clear, the sun is shining, and the city is bustling with life. Central Park is filled with people enjoying the weather, children playing, and families picnicking. People are going about their daily lives unaware of the impending disaster. The streets are crowded with pedestrians, cars honking, and the usual hustle and bustle of Times Square. It's a typical day in the city that never sleeps. Suddenly, a blinding flash engulfs the sky. The brightness is so intense that it momentarily turns day into night, leaving everyone in shock and confusion. A nuclear weapon has detonated above the city, unleashing unimaginable destruction in an instant. The sheer force of the explosion is beyond comprehension, sending shockwaves through the air. The iconic skyline disappears in a mushroom cloud of fire and smoke. The once familiar landmarks are now obscured by the devastating blast. Buildings are vaporized and millions of lives are lost in a blink of an eye. The sheer scale of the destruction is overwhelming, with entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. This is the horrifying reality of a nuclear attack. The aftermath is a scene of utter devastation, with fires raging and smoke billowing into the sky. The heart of New York City, one of the most vibrant and densely populated areas on Earth, would be completely obliterated. Times Square, once filled with lights and life, now stands empty and desolate. The Empire State Building, the Statue of Liberty, Times Square, all reduced to radioactive rubble. These symbols of hope and freedom are now nothing more than twisted metal and debris. The streets, once teeming with life, would become a desolate wasteland. The silence is deafening, broken only by the occasional sound of crumbling buildings. The immediate blast zone would be unimaginable in its devastation. Everything within this area is completely destroyed, leaving nothing but a barren landscape. Beyond the initial blast radius, the destruction would continue for miles. The shockwaves would cause buildings to collapse and the fires would spread rapidly. Shockwaves would ripple outwards, toppling buildings and shattering glass. The force of the explosion would be felt far beyond the city limits. Intense heat would ignite firestorms, engulfing entire neighborhoods in flames. The fires would spread uncontrollably, consuming everything in their path. The air itself would become toxic, filled with radioactive dust and debris. Breathing this air would be deadly, causing severe health issues for any survivors. The human cost of such an attack is almost impossible to comprehend. Families torn apart, lives shattered, and a city left in ruins. Millions of people would perish instantly, while countless others would suffer horrific injuries. The hospitals would be overwhelmed, unable to cope with the sheer number of casualties. Burns, radiation sickness, and widespread panic would grip the survivors. The psychological trauma would be immense, with people struggling to come to terms with the devastation. The lucky ones would be those who perished instantly, spared from the long and agonizing aftermath. The city would be filled with lifeless bodies, a grim reminder of the attack. The detonation of a nuclear weapon in New York City is a chilling reminder of the destructive power we possess. It serves as a stark warning of the potential consequences of such an event. It's a sobering thought that such weapons exist and that their use could have catastrophic consequences for humanity. The devastation they can cause is beyond imagination. We must work tirelessly to prevent such a scenario from ever becoming a reality. Global peace initiatives and anti-nuclear protests are crucial in ensuring that we never have to face this unimaginable horror. In the immediate aftermath of a nuclear detonation, the city would be unrecognizable. The once vibrant and bustling metropolis, filled with life and energy, would be reduced to a desolate wasteland. The skyline, once adorned with towering skyscrapers, would be replaced by a grim silhouette of destruction. The once familiar streets and landmarks would be replaced by a smoldering crater miles wide. This massive void would serve as a grim reminder of the sheer power and devastation wrought by the explosion. The heart of the city, where countless memories were made, would be nothing more than a gaping wound on the earth. The air would be thick with smoke, dust, and the smell of burning debris. The once clear skies would be choked with a dark, ominous cloud, casting a shadow over the entire region. The acrid smell of burning materials would permeate the air, making it difficult to breathe and see. Within a radius of several miles, the heat from the explosion would be so intense that everything would be instantly incinerated. Trees, cars, buildings, and even people would be reduced to ash in a matter of seconds. The landscape would be charred and blackened, a stark contrast to the vibrant life that once thrived there. People caught in the open would be vaporized. Their shadows might be the only remnants left behind, etched into the ground as a haunting reminder of their existence. The sheer heat would leave no chance for survival, erasing any trace of life in its path. Buildings would collapse into rubble. The once sturdy structures designed to withstand the test of time would crumble like sandcastles. The streets would be filled with debris, making it nearly impossible to navigate through the chaos. Even those seeking shelter underground would likely be crushed or suffocated. The force of the blast would penetrate deep into the earth, causing underground structures to collapse. Subway stations, basements, and bunkers would become death traps, offering no refuge from the devastation above. The blast wave would travel at supersonic speeds, flattening everything in its path. The sheer force would be enough to shatter windows miles away, and the shock wave would be felt far beyond the immediate blast zone. The destruction would be swift and merciless, leaving no time for escape. Those who somehow survived the initial blast would face a living nightmare. The psychological trauma of witnessing such destruction would be overwhelming. Survivors would be left to navigate a world that no longer resembled the one they knew, filled with the constant threat of further danger. The intense heat would ignite fires across the city, creating a raging inferno. These fires would spread rapidly, consuming everything in their path. The flames would be fueled by the debris of destroyed buildings and vehicles, turning the city into a hellish landscape. These firestorms would consume everything in their path, fueled by the debris of destroyed buildings and vehicles. The inferno would be uncontrollable, with flames reaching hundreds of feet into the air. The heat would be unbearable, making it impossible to approach or extinguish the fires. The air would become superheated, making it impossible to breathe. The intense heat would cause the air to shimmer, distorting the view and adding to the surreal nature of the scene. People would struggle to find breathable air, gasping for relief in the suffocating environment. The lack of oxygen and the toxic fumes would suffocate those who had miraculously survived the initial blast. The air would be filled with harmful particles, making every breath a painful struggle. The survivors would be left to contend with the poisonous atmosphere, their chances of survival dwindling with each passing moment. Adding to the horror, radioactive fallout would begin to rain down from the sky. This invisible killer would settle over the city, contaminating everything it touched. The fallout would be carried by the wind, spreading the deadly particles far and wide. This invisible killer would contaminate the air, water, and food supply. The very resources needed for survival would become tainted, posing a constant threat to those who remained. The once safe and abundant supplies would now be a source of danger, further complicating the struggle for survival. Exposure to radiation would cause a range of debilitating illnesses, including radiation sickness, cancer, and birth defects. The long-term effects would be devastating, with survivors facing a lifetime of health issues. The genetic damage caused by the radiation would affect future generations, leaving a lasting legacy of suffering. Those who inhaled or ingested radioactive particles would face a slow and agonizing death. The symptoms of radiation poisoning would be excruciating, with no hope for a quick or painless end. The hospitals, if they still stood, would be overwhelmed with the sick and dying, unable to provide adequate care. The immediate aftermath of a nuclear attack on New York City would be a scene of unimaginable destruction and suffering. The scale of the devastation would be beyond comprehension, with the city transformed into a landscape of horror. The survivors would be left to pick up the pieces, facing an uncertain and perilous future. The sheer scale of the devastation would overwhelm any rescue or relief efforts. The emergency services would be stretched to their limits, struggling to cope with the magnitude of the disaster. The chaos and confusion would hinder the response, leaving many without the help they desperately needed. The city, once a beacon of hope and progress, would become a toxic wasteland, a testament to the horrors of nuclear war. The vibrant life that once filled the streets would be replaced by silence and desolation. The ruins would stand as a grim reminder of the fragility of human civilization and the devastating consequences of nuclear conflict. Days, weeks, and months after the initial blast, the invisible killer would continue to claim lives. The initial explosion is just the beginning of a prolonged nightmare. Radioactive fallout carried by the wind would spread far beyond the blast zone, contaminating areas hundreds of miles away. This fallout is not just a local problem, it becomes a regional catastrophe. This fallout would settle on everything: buildings, trees, water sources, and people. The contamination would be pervasive, affecting every aspect of life. Exposure to even small amounts of radiation can cause serious health problems. The human body is incredibly sensitive to radiation, and even minimal exposure can have dire consequences. Radiation sickness, also known as acute radiation syndrome, can manifest in a variety of ways, from nausea and vomiting to severe burns and internal bleeding. The symptoms can be immediate or develop over time, making it a relentless and unpredictable threat. Long-term effects of radiation exposure include an increased risk of cancer, birth defects, and genetic mutations. These effects can span generations, altering the genetic makeup of entire populations. The firestorms ignited by the blast would continue to rage, releasing even more toxic smoke and ash into the atmosphere. These fires would not only destroy property, but also contribute to the environmental disaster. These fires would be difficult, if not impossible, to extinguish, as the city's infrastructure would be crippled, firefighters would be overwhelmed, and resources would be scarce. The smoke and ash would block out the sun, casting a pall over the region and potentially leading to a nuclear winter. This would disrupt weather patterns and agricultural cycles, leading to food shortages and further suffering. The long-term impact of a nuclear attack on New York City would extend far beyond the immediate casualties and physical destruction. The city's economy would be shattered, and the social fabric would be torn apart. The psychological trauma inflicted on survivors would be immense. The mental health crisis that would follow such an event would be unprecedented, with countless individuals needing long-term psychological support. The loss of loved ones, the destruction of their homes and city, and the constant fear of radiation poisoning would leave lasting scars. The emotional and psychological toll would be felt for generations as communities struggle to rebuild and recover from the devastation. The psychological toll of a nuclear attack would be as devastating as the physical damage. Survivors would grapple with the trauma of witnessing unimaginable destruction, losing loved ones, and facing an uncertain future in a contaminated world. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, anxiety, and depression would be widespread. The constant fear of radiation exposure would haunt survivors, shaping their daily lives and decisions. They would have to navigate a world forever altered, where familiar places are now dangerous and basic necessities like food and water are scarce and potentially contaminated. The social fabric of society would be torn apart as people struggle to cope with loss, fear, and the breakdown of law and order. The psychological impact would extend far beyond the immediate survivors. The knowledge that such weapons exist and could be used again would create a pervasive sense of fear and anxiety. People would live with the constant threat of annihilation, their sense of security shattered. The detonation of a nuclear weapon in New York City would not be a localized event. It would be a global catastrophe, sending shockwaves of fear and uncertainty across the world. The psychological scars of such an event would run deep, impacting generations to come.